meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes.
Adolf Hitler was a fanatical leader, a megalomaniac who led his country and many others into the abyss.
As Berlin turned to fire and ruin, one SS officer claimed he did the unthinkable. He helped Hitler escape. His 1978 interrogation was buried by officials who called it too dangerous for release.
Hitler's magnetism was not only something which could convince enormous crowds, but was also incredibly powerful.
Decades later, fragments have leaked, describing forged corpses, secret flights, and a dark mission that rewrote the war's final hours. The interrogation begins. The year was 1978. In a quiet Argentinian town surrounded by mountains, a team of investigators knocked on the door of a small apartment. Inside lived a thin, pale man in his 70s who spoke little Spanish and kept no visitors. His neighbors thought he was a retired accountant. In truth, his name had once been on a classified Allied watch list. When the investigators revealed who they were, he did not panic or deny his identity. He looked at them with calm resignation and said, "It took you long enough." He confessed that he had been an SS logistics officer stationed in the Reich Chancellery during April 1945, the final days of the Third Reich. His official job had been to oversee transport records and bunker supplies. His unofficial task, he hinted, involved orders so secret that even his immediate superiors did not fully understand them. The investigators began recording his statement, expecting another false claim from a self-styled veteran. But what he said next froze them in place. The old man insisted that Adolf Hitler had not died in the bunker as history described. The scene of suicide and burning bodies, he claimed, was fabricated. It was a legend written for Moscow, he said. He described how the Soviet Union needed the certainty of Hitler's death to legitimize its victory and stabilize post-war Europe. The man's account directly contradicted decades of accepted reports from both Soviet and Western sources. The interrogators showed him the Soviet photographs of the charred remains taken from outside the bunker. He studied them without emotion and quietly laughed. "Those bones," he said, "belong to no one you know." He then explained that many of the supposed witnesses to Hitler's death were low-ranking aides who repeated the same story because they had been ordered to. The same words, the same timing, the same gestures, he said. It was rehearsed. Throughout the questioning, the officer spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. He sounded more like a man giving a logistics report than someone describing the fall of the Third Reich. He explained that during the final days of April 1945, the corridors of the Reich Chancellery were filled with coded radio messages being transmitted between underground command posts. He said he could hear the signals echoing through the tunnels, mixed with the constant sound of machinery and explosions above. The air was thick with smoke from burning documents and fuel. He remembered soldiers pouring gasoline over files before retreating and the smell of diesel spreading through the underground passages. These details matched historical records of the last Soviet attacks on Berlin, when direct artillery hits caused fires in the fuel depots and filled the lower tunnels with choking fumes. The interrogators noted every word. They compared his timeline to Allied records from April 30th, 1945, the date universally recorded as Hitler's death, and found small but disturbing inconsistencies that no outsider could have fabricated. The officer ended his initial testimony by warning them, "Nothing that happened in Berlin was by chance. What you call an ending was a preparation." When the investigators asked what kind of preparation he meant, the old man leaned back and said, "If you want to understand, you must go below the streets. That is where the real war continued." What he described next would take them deep into the tunnels under Berlin, where another kind of operation was already underway. Operation Second Sunrise, Berlin's underground exodus. By April 1945, Berlin was collapsing under Soviet artillery. Entire districts were burning, but beneath the surface, inside the Reich Chancellery's bunker network, another kind of operation was unfolding. The officer explained that while the city above was being destroyed, the men below were not preparing for defense but for escape. He described long tables covered with maps showing underground routes that led away from the city toward airfields and rail junctions still under German control. Clerks, secretaries, and officers worked silently under the supervision of Martin Bormann, who issued orders directly from a locked chamber connected to Hitler's command room. The officer said that Bormann coordinated what was officially called Operation Second Sunrise. On paper, the mission was described as the evacuation of medical and administrative materials for humanitarian continuity in case Berlin was completely destroyed. In reality, it was a cover operation. Its real purpose was to move the most valuable assets of the Nazi regime, its leaders, wealth, and secret records, out of Berlin before the Soviets reached the Chancellery. The crates labeled medical supplies were false. They contained gold taken from the Reichsbank vaults, priceless art looted from occupied countries, and packages of counterfeit British currency created under Operation Bernhard, a wartime plan to damage the British economy with forged banknotes. These materials were chosen because they could buy safety and rebuild power. With gold, art, and hard currency, the Nazi leadership could re-establish influence, buy protection, and continue operating abroad even after Germany's defeat. The officer explained that the cargo was being sent south and west, toward areas still under partial German control or accessible to neutral countries. The first destinations were airfields outside Berlin, where Juncker's Ju-52 transport planes were still able to take off under blackout conditions. From there, the shipments were divided. Some went toward Bavaria and Austria, others toward Switzerland. Additional convoys were later sent to Spain and Portugal, which were officially neutral, but allowed Nazi officials and wealth to pass through in secret. Bormann's plan was to create what he called continuity. Even if the Reich fell, its financial and logistical core would survive. Inside the crates were also forged identity papers for high-ranking officials, contact lists for European bankers, and corporate registration documents that could later be activated to disguise Nazi assets as legitimate post-war businesses. Historians later uncovered evidence that supports this account. In 1944 and 1945, large financial transfers from German corporations such as IG Farben and Krupp appeared in Swiss banking records. The amounts were consistent with the movement of wartime assets described by the officer. The officer told investigators that he had believed he was simply following evacuation orders. Only later did he understand that he had been helping to preserve the power structure of the Nazi leadership. What was happening beneath Berlin was not about saving lives. It was about saving control. While the city above burned, trucks rolled out of the Chancellery courtyard every night under armed escort, carrying what Bormann called the future of the Reich. When the investigators asked who had authorized this secret operation, the officer answered immediately. "Bormann," he said, and then paused before adding, "And one more, the man you think is dead." The double switch. The officer said that on the night of April 28, 1945, 2 days before the Soviets reached the Reich Chancellery, he was summoned by Martin Bormann to a sealed underground chamber beneath the bunker complex. Inside the room were Bormann, SS Chief Heinrich Müller, and a military surgeon. 2 unconscious men were lying on stretchers under white sheets. When the officer asked who they were, Bormann told him they were insurance. One had been surgically altered to resemble Adolf Hitler, the other to look like Eva Braun. Both had been selected from the concentration camp system for their physical similarities. The officer said it was clear that they had been prepared for one purpose only: to die in the Führer's place. He was given detailed written instructions outlining how the switch would occur once the real Hitler and Eva Braun were gone. The doubles were to be dressed in identical clothing, placed in the private bunker quarters, and shot in a way that matched Hitler's known habits of carrying a pistol and cyanide capsule. Dental technicians were ordered to prepare duplicate dental bridges and crowns identical to Hitler's. based on impressions already stored by his personal dentist. This would later become one of the key points of Soviet identification when they claimed to have recovered Hitler's body. The officer explained that the surgeon's orders came directly from Müller, who supervised the Gestapo and had absolute authority in matters of secrecy. Containers of gasoline were already waiting to burn the bodies after the switch, ensuring that visual identification would be impossible. Selected witnesses, including bunker staff, were briefed to memorize a single version of the story and repeat it word for word after the Soviets arrived. They were told that any deviation from the official narrative would be treated as treason. Historians later confirmed that Germany's wartime dental laboratories were capable of producing perfect duplicates, and it was common for high-ranking Nazis to have backup dental molds kept for forensic reference. The Soviets based their identification of Hitler's remains largely on the recovered jaw fragments, which aligned with the officer's statement that the real Hitler's records were deliberately duplicated in advance. The officer said that when Hitler was informed of the plan, he showed no emotion. According to the account, he quietly said, "If they need a corpse, give them one." It was then that the code name Operation Serpent was used for the plan to move Hitler and Braun out of Berlin once their deaths had been staged. On April 30th, at approximately 10:30 p.m., the code phrase "Eagle ready to fly" was transmitted through secure lines. The officer was part of the convoy that left the bunker under darkness, heading toward Tempelhof Airfield. He described seeing a man in a gray coat board a Junkers Ju-52 transport plane, waiting with its engines already running. The man lifted his hand weakly in acknowledgement as the officer saluted. The plane disappeared into the night sky, heading west. At this point in the interrogation, the investigators paused the tape. The officer's next statement would move beyond the airfields of Berlin and into the open sea, where he claimed the true continuation of the escape took place. Check these two subtopics. They are good to go. I just need to frame the Argentine connection around Hitler more since the writing is about him. Don't want to ruin the structure, just to bring Hitler into it. The ghost submarines. The officer told investigators that by the spring of 1945, while Berlin was burning, another escape route had already been prepared far from the city. Admiral Karl Donitz and Martin Bormann had organized a naval evacuation called Operation Seawolf. Its purpose was to move people and assets the regime considered vital for survival. Officially, the U-boats involved were part of Germany's last Atlantic defense, but their real mission was different. Two submarines, U-530 and U-977, were modified for this task. The officer explained that both were stripped of torpedoes to make room for sealed containers and additional living quarters. Engineers reinforced sections of the hull with lead-lined plating to hide metallic signatures from Allied sonar. Inside were containers marked Cargo 1 and Cargo 2. The officer said these labels referred to two separate assignments: high-level passengers and protected documents, and that their transport orders came directly from Donitz's headquarters in Flensburg. Historical records confirm that both submarines vanished from contact in May 1945 and later surfaced months afterward at Mar del Plata, Argentina. When Allied forces interrogated their captains, they found the ships carried no logs, no listed cargo, and crews who refused to answer questions about who had been aboard before the Atlantic crossing. The official explanations never matched the technical evidence. The range those vessels had traveled exceeded their fuel capacity, and investigators discovered newly welded panels large enough to conceal compartments. The officer's testimony gave the mystery a darker meaning. He claimed that among the passengers was Adolf Hitler, whom he described as frail and visibly trembling during the final hours in Berlin. According to his account, Hitler left the Chancellery through the underground air rail connection and boarded a Ju-52 aircraft that flew him first to northern Germany and then to Spain. From a coastal base near the Canary Islands, he was transferred onto one of the Seawolf submarines under heavy guard. The officer said he saw him only once at the dock, surrounded by SS security. Hitler appeared exhausted, walking with assistants, his face pale and expression vacant. He spoke briefly to Bormann and to Donitz's adjutant before being escorted below deck. The officer remembered the silence more than any words, the sense that everyone present understood what they were witnessing. He admitted feeling horror and confusion. Until that night, he believed he was helping evacuate documents, not people. He realized too late that the operation's real purpose was to deliver the highest leadership out of Europe. Within hours, coded messages sent from Kiel confirmed that Cargo 1 and Cargo 2 had departed safely. The same region later produced unexplained radio bursts recorded by Allied monitors, consistent with transmissions from U-boats heading south. There are historical parallels that make his account partly plausible. Allied archives record intercepted signals from German vessels in the South Atlantic during May and June 1945, and U-boat wrecks found later along that route showed modifications similar to those he described. Fishermen off the Patagonian coast later reported night landings of men dressed in civilian clothes unloading metal cases before trucks carried them inland. No cargo from those landings was ever recovered. When investigators asked what was inside those containers, the officer replied that they were not carrying gold alone, but the future of the Reich, records, funds, and identities that could allow the ideology to survive. He said the sight of the submarine submerging into darkness was the moment he understood what he had done. He had helped the world's most wanted man disappear. The interrogation then moved from the oceans back to land. The investigators pressed him to describe where those submarines had gone and who had received the cargo. His next words pointed them toward Argentina. The Argentine connection. The officer told investigators that after the war, Argentina became the final refuge for those who escaped through Operation Seawolf, and possibly for Adolf Hitler himself. He described it as a graveyard for justice. Under President Juan Domingo Perón, the country offered quiet protection in many documented cases to former Nazis who arrived with money, technical skills, or political connections. According to the officer, Hitler's own security network relied on these same channels, using Argentina's sympathetic officials and corrupt intermediaries to bury both his trail and his identity. Historians agree that this protection was not always an official national policy, but rather a collaboration of individuals who believed the Reich should live on in exile. Officially, Argentina remained neutral for most of the Second World War and declared war on Germany only in March 1945. However, documented evidence indicates that Perón's government maintained informal economic and political ties with Germany throughout the early 1940s. Before becoming president, Perón had served as a military attaché in Italy, where he observed fascist models of administration and industrial control that later influenced his own policies. Many archival records show that after the war, Argentina's consulates in Europe, particularly in Genoa and Madrid, issued visas and transit documents to individuals later identified as former SS members, Nazi officials, and collaborators. Among them, the officer said, were couriers carrying sealed pouches from Donitz's headquarters, messages meant for the passenger who could never be named, a phrase historians believed referred to Adolf Hitler himself. Historians have confirmed that some of these arrivals were arranged through the so-called rat lines, escape routes organized by sympathizers in Spain, Switzerland, and Italy. These routes helped hundreds of fugitives obtain Red Cross passports or false identity papers. Argentina was one of the main destinations. According to declassified reports, many arrivals claimed to be technicians or engineers, employed in new industrial projects financed by German capital. The officer claimed these enterprises were used as coded channels for financial transfers and communications, which were part of a system meant to support the Führer in silence, wherever he had gone. He said that German businessmen already living in Argentina had prepared for these arrivals long before Berlin fell. One of the key figures he mentioned was Ludwig Freude, a powerful industrialist and close financial advisor to President Perón. Freud, the officer said, acted as the bridge between Bormann's emissaries in Europe Swiss banking officials, and Argentine authorities. Through his network, large sums of Nazi capital, including gold, cash, and corporate ownership documents, were quietly moved from Swiss accounts into newly created Argentine front companies. These firms, officially registered as shipping lines, factories, and cattle ranches, served a dual purpose: to disguise the Reich's surviving wealth and to provide logistical cover for the relocation of high-ranking fugitives. On paper, they appeared to be ordinary post-war investments, but the officer claimed their true purpose was far darker: to build and fund an infrastructure capable of sustaining what insiders called the Southern Command, or Wolfsitz Süd, the Southern Wolf's Lair, a hidden network created to protect Hitler and preserve his legacy abroad. OSS and FBI archives confirm that large transfers of German capital moved through Buenos Aires banks via Swiss intermediaries. He admitted that he personally supervised one landing near Bariloche in May 1945. He described men dressed in civilian clothes stepping onto the shore at night, one of them raising his arm briefly in the Nazi salute. Local residents later reported similar convoys heading toward Alpine estates owned by German settlers. Many of these estates were guarded by former SS personnel and remained closed to outsiders for decades. The officer said the convoys carried Cargo 1, the same designation used for Hitler's transport in Operation Seawolf, and that one of the estates had been prepared specifically for him. When investigators showed the officer aerial photographs of the estates around Bariloche, he studied them silently. After several minutes, he pointed to one property and said, "That house, I know it." It was the mansion known as Inalco, and what he revealed about it would silence the room. The Patient of Inalco. Hidden deep within the forests of Patagonia, on the southern shore of Lake Nahuel Huapi, stands the mansion known as Inalco. It was built in the 1940s by Argentine architect Alejandro Bustillo, a man who designed many of the country's elite residences. According to multiple architectural records, Inalco was financed through private investors whose names were never publicly disclosed. The estate was large, isolated, and accessible only by boat or a narrow dirt road. To the outside world, it appeared to be a summer home for wealthy Europeans. To the officer, it was something far different. The officer told investigators that this mansion became Adolf Hitler's residence after his escape from Europe. He said that Hitler lived there under the alias Herr Fischer, surrounded by a small circle of loyalists who handled his security and daily needs. He claimed that medical supplies were delivered regularly from Buenos Aires, along with crates labeled pharmaceutical equipment that were never inspected by customs. A physician named Dr. Otto Lehmann, who had treated senior officials in Germany, was said to have visited the property every few months. According to the officer, Lehmann treated Hitler for tremors, high blood pressure, and anxiety, symptoms consistent with the condition later recognized as Parkinson's disease. The estate's surroundings reinforced its secrecy. The woods were patrolled by former SS guards who lived in nearby cabins and posed as maintenance workers. The interior of the mansion, the officer said, was a careful imitation of Hitler's Bavarian retreat, the Berghof. The furniture, paintings, and tableware had been imported from Europe, much of it identical to the items in the original mountain home. Portraits of Prussian kings and old photographs of German officers hung on the walls. It was a place built to recreate a vanished world. According to the officer, Hitler referred to the post-war network that sustained him as Das Spinnennetz, the spider net. This name was used to describe the web of former Nazi officials, financiers, and sympathizers who lived across Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay. The officer said this network moved money, correspondence, and people through front companies and diplomatic channels. These details align with real historical findings. Declassified FBI memos from 1947 to 1955 mention credible but unverified reports of a man called the Old Man, living near Bariloche under strong protection. The same area later became infamous for sheltering known war criminals such as Erich Priebke and Josef Mengele. which adds weight to the officer's description of the region's hidden German communities. He described Hitler during those years as a man consumed by paranoia and bitterness. He spoke often of betrayal by Himmler and Göring, the officer said, but never by Bormann. Eva Braun, living under the name Frau Fischer, managed the household quietly. She rarely left the estate and kept a small staff of German women who spoke little Spanish. Late at night, the officer said, the sound of German folk songs could be heard from the main hall, echoes of a regime that refused to die. When the interrogators asked the officer how it ended, his hands began to shake. There was no ending, he said softly, only the illusion of one. The death that never was. According to the officer's final statement, Adolf Hitler did not live forever in hiding. He said that the man known as Herr Fischer died at Inalco in February 1962 after suffering a stroke. By then, he was an old, fragile figure who rarely left his room. The officer claimed that the burial took place quietly behind the mansion under heavy guard. There was no cross, no ceremony, and no record. Workers employed at the estate later noticed sections of the ground that had been dug up, refilled, and covered with concrete, but they were told the work was for drainage maintenance. The story would have remained another unverified claim if not for later forensic discoveries. In 2009, scientists from the University of Connecticut examined skull fragments long held in Moscow that the Soviets had identified as Hitler's remains. DNA testing proved that the bone belonged to a woman under 40, not to Hitler. This finding reignited public interest in the escape theories and made the officer's confession seem more plausible to some researchers. Historians still debate whether the mismatch resulted from a simple labeling error or from a much deeper deception created in 1945. Declassified Western intelligence files add another layer to the story. Documents from the OSS, CIA, and MI6 show that Allied agencies received dozens of reports of Hitler sightings in South America between 1945 and the early 1950s. Most were dismissed as unreliable, yet internal memos reveal that some officials believed it was politically safer during the Cold War to maintain the accepted version, that Hitler had died in Berlin. It avoided panic, prevented conspiracy movements, and allowed both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies to claim closure. Although the interview reportedly took place in 1978, it was never officially released. Fragments of the tapes and transcripts have surfaced only in recent years through anonymous leaks. Whether this confession is authentic or part of an elaborate post-war fabrication remains uncertain. Even so, many historians believe the testimony existed and was intentionally suppressed because it challenged the accepted narrative of the war's end. History continues to record Hitler's death in a Berlin bunker, but whispers like this one refuse to fade. Whether myth or truth, they suggest that what ended in 1945 was not the Reich itself, but only its visibility. What do you think about this officer's confession? Comment down below.